Officers of the law are subject to the law. They're not above the law. Laws are enacted to be obeyed. Policies are constructed to be followed, even by officers of the law. I have the privilege and honor of representing Mr. Ramirez, the plaintiff, in the case before you today. Mr. Ramirez has suffered extreme injury and pain as a result of the conduct of an officer of the law. He was shot in the back, in the scapula. The bullet traveled through the scapula and lodged near his lung. Tubes were needed to be installed in his chest. Significant medical work done to his lung. 2 liters of blood were drained, was drained from his body. He suffered all this pain due to the conduct of Officer Waldman. Mr. Ramirez, one night, happened to be December 7th, 1996, decided to go to a friend's house to watch the basketball game. He went to the house, they watched the game. Halfway through the game, they had a few beers. A 6-pack, split between the 3 of them. After the game was over, they played some cards and then proceeded to head to a few bars. It was a Friday night. They wanted to have a little fun. Went to a few bars, had a few more drinks, and after that, decided to go to a ball diamond and run a race. Just a fun Friday night. Soon he decided to head home, and on his way home, he came upon a car driving very, very slowly. Driving around 5 to 10 miles per hour. He tried to pass the car. He put on a signal to go around it, but the car would swerve out so that he couldn't get by. Eventually, the car pulled over to the side of the road, and Mr. Ramirez pulled up alongside of the car. He was irate at this point. He got out of the car, and as he went around the back of the car over to the officers, he saw another ordinary guy dressed in plain clothes. The car, a regular car, unmarked. He went up to the individual and they exchanged words. He was irate. He was screaming. They were yelling at each other. And then he was hit, punched in the face by this man. We know now that that man was Officer Levy. An altercation ensued. They fought for a while. They wrestled with each other. Eventually, Mr. Ramirez was thrown to the ground. Officer Levy was on top of Mr. Ramirez. At that time, he identified himself, Mr. Levy did, as a police officer. When Mr. Ramirez heard that it was a police officer, he stopped. He stopped fighting, threw up his hands as he laid on his back, and as Officer Levy got off, he began to sit up. He began to get up. And at that moment, he felt pain. He felt pain in his back. He had been shot by Officer Waldman as he was getting up off the ground. Shot in the back. Officers of the law, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, are subject to the law. The city of Chicago had a policy on the use of deadly force. Mr. Waldman had not followed that policy. He shot Mr. Ramirez in the back when Mr. Ramirez was not threatening anyone with anything. He was getting up off of the ground. These officers of the law, we call them peace officers. They have a duty to protect citizens, not to harm them. Mr. Ramirez would like to be compensated for the damages that he has suffered as a result of the misconduct of this officer of the law. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you're going to hear a story today from a defense, an alibi from the officers, both Officer Waldman and Levy. Officer Levy will testify today about the events that occurred on December 7th, 1996. They will talk about a knife. They will tell you a story that as they drove along that street and Mr. Ramirez went to pass them, they'll tell you that he swerved in front of them, blocking them off so that they could not enter. They will tell you that he got out of his car, came over with a knife in hand, and attacked Officer Levy after Officer Levy had told him Mr. Ramirez that they were police officers. They will tell you that he attacked and stabbed Officer Levy in the left shoulder. and then as the fight ensued, Officer Waldman got out of the car and came around, and just after Mr. Ramirez had already stabbed Officer Levy once, he raised the knife up to stab him again, and only then did Officer Waldman pull the trigger on his gun, thinking at that moment that it was his only opportunity to save possibly the life of Officer Levy. Ladies and gentlemen, you're going to hear a story from the officers. They're going to tell you a story about a cut wound. They're going to present evidence that Mr. Ramirez had a cut, or excuse me, that Officer Levy did have a cut on his left shoulder. Ladies and gentlemen, their story is inconsistent. Ladies and gentlemen, their defense not only conflicts with itself, with other testimony from their fellow officer, it also conflicts with objective facts, the police report, other testimony from doctors, testimony that you'll hear later on today. It's not consistent. Mr. Ramirez's testimony is consistent. It's consistent with the objective facts. Remember, the police report showed that when he pulled alongside of the car, that he was parallel to the car. The officers will testify that he cut them off. There's an inconsistency there. They will testify that there was a knife. There was a knife found at the scene of the crime, but that knife was not Mr. Ramirez's knife. He had never seen the knife before. He did not own the knife. He will not be able to even identify that knife. The only time he's seen that knife is in deposition testimony, or when it was shown to him after the events of December 7th, 1996. That was not his knife. Furthermore, there were no fingerprints on the knife. There was no blood on the knife. The knife that they allege stabbed Officer Levy. Ladies and gentlemen, officers of the law are subject to the law. When their conduct is in violation of the law, when their conduct is in violation of policies that are created to govern their conduct, they must be held accountable. Mr. Ramirez has suffered great pain today due to the conduct of officers of the law. We must hold them accountable. You'll hear later testimony from a doctor who feels that it is consistent with his version of what happened after reviewing the medical record of Mr. Ramirez is consistent with Mr. Ramirez's story. The police officer's testimony, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, is inconsistent with itself and with objective facts. Will you hold these officers of the law accountable to their actions? Ladies and gentlemen, they have a duty to protect citizens, not to harm them. Mr. Ramirez was harmed by the conduct of an officer of the law. Will you hold them accountable today? Thank you.